Good night, according to the local time, from Metro Manila, the Philippines, Southeastern Asia. On September the 11th, 1973, or almost exactly 50 years ago, Chile moved from being a left wing democracy under the socialist and Marxist president Salvador Allende to becoming a right wing military dictatorship under General Augusto Pinochet, a dictatorship that would last until the formal restoration of democracy following the election of Patricio Aylwin, a Christian Democrat, as the next Chilean president, and he took office in March 1990. So for 16 and a half years, Chile then remained a military dictatorship, and over 40,000 people were killed by soldiers or police officers who were loyal to General and then later President Pinochet. But how had it come to this? How had the high hopes, the euphoria that so many Chileans, especially the left wing members of the lower and working classes and even middle classes, had felt when Allende had first narrowly won a plurality in the September 1970 Chilean presidential elections, 36.6% compared to the right wing candidate, former President Jorge Alessandri's 35.3%, and to the centrist Christian Democratic presidential candidate Radomir Tomic's 28.1%. And then only 7 months later, in April 1971, in the Chilean local elections, meaning city council, town council, and mayoral elections, the Unidad Popular, or a combination of an alliance of several left wing parties, ranging all the way from the left wing dissident Christian Democrats to the communists, had received over 49% of the vote. And despite the growing socioeconomic problems, including the galloping inflation, the ballooning deficit, budget deficit, and national debt, and the rising number of strikes and acts of violence, and the increasingly polarized political culture, mass media, so the radio stations, television channels, publication houses, and newspapers and magazines. Despite all those problems, and of course the ballooning inflation hit Allende's main constituency, the lower and the lower and working classes, the hardest. Of course, it did touch also the middle class and to a limited extent the upper class. But despite all these problems, Allende's left wing coalition Unidad Popular, or People's Unity, was able to receive over 43% of the vote in the March 1973 Chilean congressional elections and was able to gain several seats. So both sides, the left wing Unidad Popular and then the center right Democratic Concertation or Coalition, um, were able to claim victory. Unidad Popular, because at least it had been able to gain several seats, and it had enough seats um, in the Chamber of Deputies, the lower house of the Chilean Congress, to prevent Allende from being impeached and removed from office, because that would require, or would have required, a two-thirds majority. And that was the one that the center-right opposition parties did not have. But of course, the center-right opposition parties could claim that they had a mandate from the Chilean people because, after all, they had received over 54% of the vote. Allende had survived just 2.5 months before the decisive coup d'etat of September the 11th, 1973, the so-called tanquetazo, or armored vehicles or tanks attempt to overthrow him. Of course, they had been manned and driven to the sides of the Chilean presidential Palace La Moneda by a group of rebellious soldiers on June the 29th, 1973. And yes, on that day, tragically, some 20 people died, including one foreign journalist and a few or some bystanders, sorry. But still, Allende had been able to survive it because one of the brave um, and loyal Chilean army officers, at the risk of his life, um, appealed to these rebellious soldiers, reminding them of the doctrine of profesionalismo. In other words, that the Chilean soldiers should look after the country's external and internal stability and security and should not interfere in politics. So any soldiers, including army officers who then wanted to participate in politics, would have to resign from the Chilean army. And still, on that day, June the 29th, 1973, the rebellious soldiers had then decided to surrender to the loyal ones. Allende had made overtures in August 1973 to the army by appointing General Prats as the defense minister and then by appointing the ultimately rebellious General Augusto Pinochet to a senior position in the Chilean army. Little did he realize that the military coup's planners had already been planning it at least for some, probably several months. And then on the night of September the 10th to 11th, 1973, in the northern Chilean coastal city, Chile borders on the Pacific Ocean in the west and the South Atlantic Ocean in the extreme south, or then the Southern Ocean. They moved during that dark night to effectively take control of the city, something that President Allende found out on the morning, fateful morning of September the 11th, 1973. Unable to reach Pinochet by phone and not realizing before it was too late to stop the coup that Pinochet was actually leading it. He commented, "Poor Pinochet, he's not reachable or he doesn't know what is going on," or something like that. But he did know. After 7 o'clock that fateful morning, President Allende drove from his official residence in Tomas Moro in Santiago de Chile, the Chilean capital, to the presidential palace, La Moneda, and after having made one or more phone calls and after having been briefed on the situation, he took to the airwaves and made the first one of his 6 live radio broadcasts within the space of about 1 hour and 15 minutes. So starting at 5 minutes to 8 o'clock that morning Chilean time, he spoke to the Chilean voters, especially the workers, for the first time, informing them that there was a coup attempt on the part of some soldiers of the Chilean Navy in the city of Valparaiso, and he appealed to them to quietly and calmly stay in their working places and to wait for updates that he would give to them. But during the next hour, the situation deteriorated. Already at 8:15, his tone was considerably more dramatic. So just 20 minutes after the first broadcast, he updated those Chileans who were still listening to his radio broadcasts that the province of Valparaiso was then controlled by the rebellious soldiers. And just 30 minutes later, at 8:45 in the Chilean time that morning, he told the listeners that most members of the armed forces were rebelling against the government. He was offered by at least one of the rebellious soldiers the possibility of flying away in an airplane, but at least one of the website articles that I've read about the coup um, actually claimed that the airplane probably was sabotaged. In other words, it would have crashed. So in that case, Allende and whoever else would have been on board would have died in any case. And already during the hour from 8 o'clock to 9 o'clock that morning, he made reference to the possibility that he could be killed in the coup attempt, but he refused to resign. He even recalled some of the words that he had made in a long and rather dramatic speech at the Chilean National Stadium in Santiago de Chile in December 1971. He had said that he didn't have what it took to be a messiah or an apostle, or a messiah. In other words, he essentially was saying that he didn't see himself as any kind of a divinely instituted authority figure. He didn't even, in his opinion, have conditions of a martyr. He considered himself simply as a social fighter who was filling a task as the Chilean president that the Chilean voters, the people, had given him. And then he vowed to finish his 6-year presidential term. Nowadays, the Chilean presidents serve a maximum of 2 separate 4-year terms. So they can't serve back-to-back terms. So in that sense, every second Chilean presidential election potentially is one that is open in the sense that the incumbent president cannot run, or then one of the candidates is a former president who has already served one of the 2 constitutionally permitted terms. But this was not yet the case back in those days, although Allende technically could have served a second term. So assuming that he would have completed his first term from 1970 to 1976, he could have then run for president again in 1982. But this was not to be. So Allende dramatically declared, just 13 months after taking office, in that speech, the most famous and notorious listener of which was the communist Cuban dictator Fidel Castro, who was a close friend of Allende. So on that day in December 1971, to conclude the 4-week visit to Chile by the dictator Castro, that he was determined, Allende claimed that he was determined to finish his 6-year term as president that would end, that was scheduled to end in November 1976, and only if he was riddled with bullets, in other words, assassinated, would he fail to complete the term. Well, as it turned out, he was riddled by 2 bullets that he himself shot into his head in the badly damaged and partly burning Palace La Moneda on the afternoon of September the 11th, 1973, because he did not want to go through the humiliation of having to surrender to the rebellious soldiers. So Allende began his presidency in an atmosphere of general goodwill. Even many Christian Democrats were willing to give him the benefit of the doubt, because after all, the previous Chilean president, Christian Democrat Eduardo Frei, who had campaigned and won the 1964 Chilean presidential election on the slogan Revolución en Libertad, or Revolution in Freedom, he had instituted with the help of the Chilean Congress, which was dominated by the Christian Democrats at the time, um, a number of left leaning reforms, such as a redistribution of the farmland. However, he hadn't gone as far as Allende promised and tried to go. Allende was at the same time a Marxist socialist who believed in principle in the class struggle between the propertied classes, the middle and especially upper classes, and then the lower and working classes. However, he was not an orthodox Marxist to the core because he rejected one of the cornerstones of orthodox Marxist communism and socialism. In other words, the inevitable violent and bloody revolution. Instead, he favored peaceful, gradual reforms, which of course meant that given the multi-party nature of the Chilean politics, he would have to get enough votes also from the middle class Chileans in order for him to be able to gradually persuade the Chilean Congress during his presidential term to pass more and more of these socialist reforms to the Chilean society and economy. So he set out to accomplish this program. He raised, according to the Grimberry History of Nations, volume 24, I think, the Chilean wages, even accounting for the inflation, by 50%. Then, according to other sources, online sources, he boosted significantly the healthcare, educational, and nutritional budgets. At first, he was able to cooperate fairly well on numerous legislative proposals with the Christian Democrats. And indeed, in 1971, the Chilean inflation rate was still a modest or moderate compared to the many previous years, 20%. However, it grew exponentially to over 200%, if I remember correctly, in 1972, and then for the entire year 1973, despite the fact that Allende's left-wing government was overthrown in September of that year, I think it was over 600%. Allende gave a televised interview to a French philosopher and journalist, Mr. Régis Debray. I think it was in January 1971, so if this memory flash is correct, Allende had been in office only for 2 months. And Allende, in a sense, praised himself and the People's Unity Coalition for having been able to unite Christians with communists. So he was referring to the fact that there were some left-wing Christian Democrats in the alliance, electoral alliance, and there were communists as well. And he basically explained in that televised interview that in order to be able to win the Chilean presidential elections and to be able to start implementing or putting into practice his socialist reform proposals, he had decided to sign the Accord of Constitutional Guarantees with the Christian Democratic leaders in October 1970, because at the time, the Chilean constitution did not allow a second round or so-called runoff direct popular vote in case no presidential candidate won a majority on the first round. Instead, the Chilean Congress was to meet in a joint session and elect the winner, choosing either one of the two top vote getters, the two most popular presidential candidates. And even though the Republican administration of US President at that time, Richard Nixon, applied pressure on numerous members of the Chilean Congress, most of them were Christian Democrats, to vote for Alessandri with the intention of preventing Allende from taking office. And one of those proposals, electoral interference proposals, envisioned Alessandri being elected president and then resigning shortly after taking office, in which case the previous president, Christian Democrat Frey, would have been able to run in the early presidential elections. But this was not to be. Just 2 days before the crucial vote that was to take place on October the 24th, 1970, by the members of the Chilean Congress to uh, choose either Senator Allende or former President Alessandri as the next Chilean president, there was a tragic kidnapping attempt on the members of some right-wing or far-right soldiers or criminals of General René Schneider, who strictly believed in the doctrine of professionalismo, or political non-interference by the members of the Chilean armed forces. The kidnapping attempt failed, um, and General Schneider tried to defend himself by firing one or more shots from his own gun. Unfortunately, Schneider was badly wounded and he died of his wounds in a hospital just 3 days later on October the 25th. But on October the 24th, Allende was elected by a huge majority as the new Chilean president. 153 members of the 200-member Chilean Congress voted for him. Only 35 supported former President Alessandri, and then 7 members of the Chilean Congress were present but did not participate in the vote. In other words, they abstained, and the other 5 were absent. Accordingly, on November the 3rd, 1970, Allende took office as the new Chilean president. Many of his supporters were gathered in Santiago and they chanted triumphantly, Allende, Allende, Allende. Um, President Allende also wanted to deepen the land reform that had been continued or begun by his Christian Democratic predecessor. He naturally defended the workers' right to strike, and then there was a strike by truck drivers that turned violent. So, because he believed in democratic socialism and La Via Chilena al Socialismo, or the Chilean road to socialism, he favored gradual, carefully thought out, compromise seeking, but nevertheless socialist reforms. And yes, he nationalized or took over and changed into state corporations numerous large-scale industries, notably copper mining and banking. Also, his government managed the Chilean healthcare system and tried to reform and otherwise improve the Chilean schools or educational system, and distributed free milk for children in the schools and in the shanty towns of Chile, and also expanded the land seizure and redistribution that had already started under his Christian Democratic predecessor. He also tried to improve the socio-economic well-being of Chile's poorest people. So they were to have jobs either in the new nationalized enterprises or on public work projects. In November 1970, the month when Allende became the new Chilean president, 3,000 scholarships were allocated to Mapuche children or indigenous children in an effort to integrate that minority into the educational system. Also, the payment of pensions and grants was resumed. Um, an emergency plan providing for the construction of 120,000 residential buildings was launched. All part-time workers were granted rights to Social Security. A proposed electricity price increase was withdrawn. Diplomatic relations were restored with Cuba, and political prisoners were pardoned. And in December 1970, bread prices were fixed in order to help the poorer or poorest Chileans to buy bread without having to, for example, uh, default on their debt, their possible rents. And then 55,000 volunteers were sent to uh, southern Chile to teach writing and reading skills and to provide medical attention to a sector of the population who had, during the earlier administrations, been ignored. And then a central commission was established to institute a three-partite payment plan where equal place was given to government employees and employers. Even free school meals were established. Yeah, so the inflation rate, which had been 36.1% in 1970, fell to 22.1% in 1971, and the average real wages adjusted for inflation rose by 22.3% in 1971. But those advances, of course, came at a heavy cost because the central government expenditures in Chile increased, even adjusted for inflation, by 36%. And the public sector engaged in a huge housing program, starting to build 76,000 houses in 1971 compared to just 24,000 in 1970. So in early 1971, just a few months after becoming the Chilean president, Allende raised minimum wages in real terms for blue-collar workers by between 37% and 41%, and by 8 to 10% for white-collar workers. And in 1972, blue-collar wages were raised by 27%, even accounted for inflation, and white-collar wages became fully indexed. The new agriculture minister of Chile, Jacques Chonchol, promised to expropriate all estates or take over by the government which were larger than 80 basic hectares or about 200 acres. And no farm in Chile was larger than 80 basic hectares by the end of 1972. And especially in the countryside of Chile, Allende's government launched a campaign against illiteracy, in other words, the inability to functionally write and read. Adult education programs were expanded, and even workers got more educational opportunities. And from 1971 to 1973, more children, teenagers, and young adults enrolled in the kindergarten, primary or elementary, high school, and post-secondary schools. Um, the Women's Secretariat was established in 1971, and it started to tackle issues such as public laundry facilities, public food programs, daycare centers, and women's health care, especially uh, the health care of pregnant women. and especially the housing, education, and health budgets significantly grew. In the first year of Allende's term, the short-term economic results of the economy minister Pedro Vuckovic's expansive monetary policy were favorable: 12% industrial growth and an 8.6% increase in gross domestic product. Even the unemployment rate fell to 3.8%. However, by 1972, the Chilean escudo or currency already had an inflation rate of 140%, and the average real gross domestic product adjusted for inflation fell by fell between 1971 and 1973 at an annual rate of 5.6%. And the very fact that Allende tried to proceed to these socialist reforms was strongly opposed by Chilean landowners, employers, businessmen, and transporters associations, and even by some civil servants and professional unions. So the right wing opposition to Allende's administration was led by the National Party, the Roman Catholic Church, and eventually the Christian Democrats. Allende also had trouble dealing with foreign multinational corporations and the US federal government. From 1970 to 1972, exports fell by 24%, imports rose by 26%, including a whopping 149% increase in the imports of food products. Chile's export income fell because of a hard hit copper industry, because copper's price on international markets fell by almost a third. Also, Chile's copper production after the copper mines had been nationalized or taken over by the government decreased. Copper is still Chile's single most important export because over half of Chile's export receipts were from that sole commodity. In 1971, Chile re-established diplomatic relations with Cuba, therefore joining Mexico and Canada in rejecting a previously established Organization of American States convention prohibiting governments in the Western Hemisphere from establishing diplomatic relations with a communist island country. In October 1972, so just 11 months before Allende was overthrown, the first of what were to be a wave of strikes was led first by truckers, later by small businessmen, some unions or trade unions, and some student groups. And the main effect of the 24-day or 3.5 week strike was to induce Allende to bring the head of the Army General Carlos Prats into the government as Interior Minister. And then there was a blame game. So President Allende and his opponents in Congress repeatedly accused each other of undermining the Chilean constitution and acting undemocratic. And we have to remember that Allende actually was not an extreme socialist. There were socialists who were even more radical than himself, and of course communists, who would have wanted him to go even further with those reforms, while a growing number of right-wing and centrist Chileans were against the continuation of his socialist reforms. So in 1972, Chile's inflation rate stood at 150%, and it became far, far larger in 1973. Um, Then Allende began negotiations with Bolivia, another South American country, over the historical dispute between the two countries, and welcomed Bolivia's maritime request. But relations became tense again because Bolivian General Hugo Banzer overthrew the legally elected president in August 1971. Chile also granted asylum to thousands of political exiles from Latin American countries. Um, the People's Unity government tried to maintain normal relations with the United States, but with only mixed success. By contrast, Chile gained commitments from the Soviet Union to invest about 400 million US dollars in Chile in the next 6 years. However, Allende's government was disappointed in receiving less economic assistance from the Soviets than it had hoped for. Um, so on August the 22nd, 1973, a constitutional crisis occurred, and the Chamber of Deputies passed a non-binding resolution accusing Allende's administration of unconstitutional acts because Allende had refused to carry out constitutional amendments already approved by the Chamber of Deputies. Those amendments or changes to the Chilean constitution would have prevented his government from continuing his massive nationalization plan. And also, there were criticisms of his increasingly frequent use of the emergency decrees, even though they were still in the Chilean constitution at the time. So on August the 9th, Allende appointed General Prats as defense minister, but Prats was forced to resign already on August the 24th, 1973, as defense minister and as the Chilean army's commander-in-chief. And General Augusto Pinochet replaced him as the army commander-in-chief. The resolution had been passed by a vote of 81 to 47. However, Allende refused to take it very seriously. Claiming that she had simply spoken sorry. That he had simply tried to fulfill the tasks that the Chilean voters had given him, and that the resolution was politically motivated. So his farewell speech included, for example, the following lines. With gunfire and explosions clearly audible or hearable in the background. That he reviewed briefly what he had tried to accomplish for Chile and its people, especially its workers. He commended those workers, farmers, intellectuals, and students who had remained loyal to him, and asked them to remember him as a man who had been loyal to the fatherland. He promised to refuse to resign and ended his speech with these dramatic statements. or sentences. Workers of my country, I have faith in Chile and its destiny. Other men will overcome this dark and bitter moment when treason seeks to prevail. Keep in mind that much sooner than later, the great avenues will again be opened through which will pass free men to construct a better society. Long live Chile, long live the work people, long live the workers, and so forth. So, approximately at 10 minutes to 2 p.m., with the presidential palace being badly damaged and burning in several places, he told his remaining supporters, there are over 20 people, to give up, to surrender. And he personally shook hands with each of them. And then he went to the Independence Hall of the presidential palace, where a medical doctor who was present heard him shout using a swear word. Allende doesn't give himself up, and then saw him shoot himself with an AK-47 rifle to the head. Uh, the impact of the two bullets badly destroyed his skull and killed him instantly. And the this official verdict of suicide, was confirmed by forensic experts in 2011, so already 38 years after Allende's death. So for many left-wingers throughout Chile and most of the rest of the world, at least, he remained a hero. He tried to make Chile into a model socialist democracy, although he badly failed in the attempt. To his critics and especially enemies, he may have had high ideals, but he was a too impractical politician, too unrealistic politician, too ideologically left-wing politician to implement them or to put them into practice. And therefore his legacy remains mixed, even in today's Chile. In 2022, I think in September 2022, in fact, so 1 year ago, the Chilean voters, by a clear majority, 62% to 38%, rejected a basically left-wing or left-leaning set of constitutional amendments that would have replaced the current Chilean constitution, which dates back to 1980, the time of Augusto Pinochet's dictatorship, with a more progressive constitution. It would have enshrined the Chilean indigenous or native people's rights in law, but also abortion rights. And then Chile still is divided, quite heavily divided, between the more traditional and conservative, and then the more progressive people and the ones in the middle. So that was probably why it was rejected. And we have to remember that President Allende was the first democratically elected Marxist leader in Latin America. Originally, he had worked as a medical doctor. In 1933, aged 24-25, he had been one of the founders of the Chilean Socialist Party. In 1937, he had been elected to the Chamber of Deputies, and then he had served as the health minister in the liberal left-wing government of President Pedro Aguirre Cerda. In 1945, he had been elected to the Chilean Senate and had been re-elected to the upper House of the Chilean Congress in 1953, 1961, and 1969. He had even served as the president or chairperson of the Chilean Senate from 1966 to 1969. He had, in 1952, run for president for the first time, getting over 5% of the vote. In 1958, he had received over 28% of the vote, finishing second to Jorge Alessandri. In 1964, despite receiving over 38% of the vote, he had been distanced by some 17% or so by the Christian Democratic candidate Eduardo Frei. And then in the 1970 Chilean presidential elections, he had narrowly defeated Alessandri by 36.6% of the vote compared to Alessandri's 35.3% and Tomici's 28.1%. The Chilean Congress had passed the Nationalization Amendment to the Constitution in July 1971. But he had not been able to achieve everything that he had tried to see. So this is basically my video about the 1973 Chilean coup d'etat. I'm glad that Chile has, for the last 33 years, been a reasonably stable democracy. But of course, we need to hope and pray that it will become, in the future, an even more stable and united democracy. Bye bye, and have a great and blessed September and remainder of this